Welcome to our Substack Live, everyone. I have with me Inara, my dear friend, philosopher, and guide. Welcome, Inara.
Thank you. I have never been introduced as a philosopher. That was really exciting.
Yeah. I think you're one of those people who does not know their own gifts in some capacity. So I think that's one of the most beautiful things about you.
Thank you, Akil.
Yeah. So, uh, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We are here today with my friend Inara to talk about something that we don't really talk often about in our culture, and that's grief, um, and how it is such an integral part of our life, uh, but something that we don't really want to look at too often. Uh, we are here having this conversation today because Inara and I are both convinced that grief has the potential to radically transform our lives for the better. Uh, it offers a doorway into wholeness, which we might really otherwise miss if we don't spend the time to look into the depths of grief. We also believe that it is one of the root problems in our world today and the outer crises that we see in terms of climate change, war, polarization. All of these are manifestations of the chaos that we have within ourselves. So I thank you so much for joining us. I hope this conversation on grief will be something which will stay with you and invite you to go into your own journey. And you will find the fruits of grief as I have in the last couple of years and in my time working with Inara. Thank you again for joining us, Inara.
Yeah, thank you, Akil. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So let's begin with telling people a bit about you. So, of course, like I mentioned, you're my friend, philosopher, and guide, but you have been doing this work for the last 20 years in some capacity or the other. You've had your own meditation and movement practice. And then 15 years ago, you got a degree in counseling and dance therapy. And then you have been finding increasingly creative ways to apply that knowledge to help people uh, heal and come to terms with grief. And you've been a life and death coach. Um, Well, you've been a Reiki practitioner, you have been a consultant, you have offered support to communities doing their work. You're really been such a pillar of strength to people and communities in so many ways. Um, and even in these times that we find ourselves in, like you feel the strong calling to be of service to uh, people who are doing the work of uh, trying to ensure that we get through these turbulent times and come out better onto the other side. So, thank you so much for the work that you do. I have personally been a great beneficiary of your generosity. Um, and I think it's worth telling people how we met. Uh, and uh, it's again a testament to the power of the internet. Uh, Last month I had a conversation with Joe Cook about the meta crisis, and again he's a friend I've made through the internet, and um, you and I met in this conference called Limicon, which was a gathering of people contemplating what to do about the meta crisis. And I reached out, and you were kind enough to agree to a conversation, and it was very strange for me to hear about what you do. You had said that you are a grief counselor and a death doula. It was the first time I'd heard that term. It sounded a little morbid, but as I continued talking to you, I realized that it was anything but. Uh, uh, for people who are not aware of the term death doula, you're somebody who helps people come to peace and like with the fact that their life is at an end, and end their lives with dignity and coming to terms with all the unresolved questions that they might have, uh, which is just such beautiful work. And uh, I found that like it was very difficult for me to imagine the kind of strength uh, it would take to do that work. Uh, but you consider it to be extremely life giving. It wasn't morbid for you at all. So I think that is where it's worth beginning our conversation. Um, you know, can you help people understand how do you define grief and why you think it is such a important part of a full life?
Yeah, well, and first I want to speak to some of what you shared about me becoming a death doula. Definitely that process was focused on the act of sitting with those who are actively dying, but much the same as the work I had been doing with individuals in coaching and counseling sessions, I found that the concept of death, or really the concept of endings or change of any kind, was what kept coming up.
Hmm.
And so that's part of what drove me towards doing the certification to be an end of life coach and death doula, was just that's what people wanted to talk about. And so I knew that I needed to train to be more prepared for those conversations. And in earnest, it was being with my dad as he passed that initiated me, in a sense, into that work as well. And so then throughout those conversations and being in the presence of grief, that brought me into an awareness of how I experience grief and what grief was asking me to do in my life, which wasn't to just be sad all the time, I found, but was to really reflect on who I am, what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and if that's most true. And so there was this opportunity for me, and what I came to understand grief to be is a process of discerning what is here right now and what of what is here with me that I might be holding on to and just not wanting to let go of, even though there's a natural calling to release it in some way. And so a lot of my initial work with grief was around recognizing what I was really attached to and just didn't want to let go of.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's an important recognition in the definition of grief. In the simple way, it's grieving the loss of something. But I've come to recognize it's so much more rich and multifaceted than that when you contemplate life as just a series of endings and changes and transitions somewhat constantly until the big one that is the end of our life. That is that culmination moment where we've heard stories about people really reflecting on their whole lives in that moment. And so you can wait until the end of your life to reflect on your whole life, or you can kind of live through the reflection of your life and allow yourself the permission to change and grow where and when that might be of service. And so that's what grief has come to mean for me. It's an opportunity to consider who you are and what you're doing, and if there might be changes you want to make, and finding the processes that support you in choosing that work.
Uh, uh, that's a very powerful frame, and I love the fact that you are pointing to the fact that the impermanence of all things, and if we really contemplate the fact that everything that is dear to us will come to pass, and then it invites us to arrive into life more fully, be more mindful of what matters to us. Uh, and it doesn't have to be just this one big thing. You're not necessarily, uh, you don't necessarily have to wait till the end of life to do this process. It can allow you to enrich your day to day, which I think is a very powerful frame. Um, I, I, I do want to touch on what you mentioned about how you came to do this work, and then also, well, and then that was through the death of your father, which is obviously such a big event. But then also this other aspect that you kind of hinted at, that grief shows up day to day, and there are always things that we are losing, right? Because when we talk about grief, we typically talk about the big events, like you mentioned, the passing of your father, but it is about so much more. Um, so yeah, like, do you want to share a bit about what happened with your father that led you to like your own unique relationship with grief?
Yeah, so I think perhaps the most powerful part of watching my dad die was myself coming to terms with the recognition that I had witnessed him not live his life fully. And it kind of reframed suddenly in that moment right before he physically was no longer in my world, reframed so many moments where I felt frustrated or angry with him. And instead, I was able to see it from the pain and from the sense that he couldn't choose something else. And I received this clarity of just the conflict he must have been experiencing for so much of his life. Um, and so, I was really, fortunate to be able to be with him and be with him in that final moment where he had this really intense moment non-verbally, but eyes wide open, and I felt as though he was seeing things clearly right before he died. And so it was so exhilarating to be with him in that moment, and I always talk about it as, like, it was a level of connection I'd never felt with him in any other time in my life with him, and I'm so glad that I had it, but then also the next instant, he was physically gone. And so it was so profound. But I, since then, for the past 6 years, have continued to really digest that recognition that we can feel as though we can't change things. We can't make adjustments. We can't be bold enough to be honest about who we are and how we want to be in the world, or even honest about what we're seeing in the world, especially during these times, because of fear, because of anxiety, because of logistics, because of, realities as to what the consequence might be if you start to push against those edges. But watching him die, I really felt connected to the consequence that is always looming, that if I don't do it now, if I don't lean into how to be my truest self and how to show up in the world the way I think I'm meant to, so that I can have good relationships and so that I can, create an impact in the world or just do whatever it is brings me joy, then am I really living? And that was what I really sat with as I grieved and continue to grieve my dad, is just the recognition that I don't think he felt permission to live, because it might have been disruptive. It might have upset people if he had said what he was really feeling or made changes in ways that would have benefited him. And yeah, I didn't want to run into that. And then, as I said, as I continue to work with people and everybody was really struggling with endings and changes, it felt like the best thing I could do is just sit with them in that space and not push them to change, but to be curious about it and just recognize there might be an opportunity here. I don't know. Let's not know together first, before we do anything rash. But grief and grief processes I've found to just be an opportunity to be curious and to lean into our strength as individuals, but then also the strength of our relationships to consider what might be possible.
Hmm. Okay. Wow. I'm gonna sit with that for a bit.
Mhm.
Uh, I feel like I want to pick up on this thread that you mentioned, that your dad felt like he never had permission to be himself. Uh, and and it is only towards the end of his life he kind of his the death clarified uh, that for him in a certain way, and that brought him alive in a way, it seems like, right? Like he could be himself and he felt that profound sense of connection. Um, why do you think that is that he felt like he couldn't be himself, and you know there's something there about our culture where even you know uh, grief is something which is not really welcome. Like, we want grief to be very linear, short-lived, a private affair. There's so many of these parts of our lives and ourselves that we hide away. So just talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I think, my dad is an example of what, happened in his own way specifically, but might happen for each of us in varying ways. I know it's true for me, but I know my dad specifically was impeded by trauma, which, he had some horrible things happen that informed his sense of himself and informed who and how he felt he needed to be. Um, he was struggling with some gender stereotypes and feeling like he needed to provide for his family, which to some degree meant spend every waking moment working. Um, and and I think any moment when he started to reach towards the truth of himself, there were people around him that were struggling in their own ways, and so then they too reacted or responded to him negatively, and so there was just a lot of negative feedback, in response to any opportunity I think he could have had to consider, "Oh, I think something needs to change," or, "I think I want something to change." And so if he were to have responded to it, it would have rippled out, it would have generated a negative effect, and so it was just avoided. So I think in that way, the process of grief can kind of sometimes bring us to a reckoning that might call us into deep contemplation as to whether or not we let things be how they are, or we initiate change within ourselves that might be felt in the way of just rippling out, or might really be changed because there's a conversation that needs to be had, or a move that needs to be made. And so I think for a lot of us, we don't want to, stir the pot. We don't want to churn the water, and essentially making those types of choices is to do that courageously and trust that, yes, there might generate a disruption initially, but those things tend to settle with time. And if we've checked ourselves, if it feels real and true and in integrity, though there might be disruption, the hope would be that it would find stillness somehow, and even maybe if it has true integrity, be what's best for everyone involved. And so I just think that there are ways in which we perceive we might be able to control things more than we actually can. And a lot
Mm,
of what we try to control is to not rock the boat, not make people upset. And so it can be difficult to lean into what grief shows us and teaches us because it feels like that's going to potentially cause a problem. And so I know from my dad, you know, it didn't feel like there was anything he could do right. So he just didn't do anything. And so then his essence just faded away until he finally passed. Yeah.
okay. And I think this is the first time I am hearing the story of your dad in so much detail, and yeah, it sounds very painful to have gone through life like that. As well. And I can't, as somebody who is a highly aware and empathetic person, I cannot imagine how hard it would have been for you because you would have felt the weight of all of that.
Mm. And the way that I'm sharing about it in this moment, I will just say, because of the amount of grief work I've done, feels very different than when it first happened. I feel, to some degree, you know, almost joyful in his departure of his body, because his body was a lot of what had created the suffering in this life. So that was part of the grief process that I moved through that helped me find peace and find joy, you know, for the little moments that might have been few and far between, when I'm now realizing, like, oh, I saw him in that moment, whether it was him making a joke with a nurse, or, you know, he and I having, songs that we would sing together. There were glimmers, and so my grief process has been one of letting myself see where almost like life couldn't help but happen in him, and that I did get to see those moments. So it wasn't like he just was unalive his whole life. There were glimmers, there were moments. And so that supports me in feeling at peace, that he did have those moments. But of course, I wish he had felt even more permission.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it it highlights that uh, this other aspect you mentioned to me before. Um, in touching grief, we can often feel like, because we have to contemplate the imperfection of our life and the parts that we don't really like so much. We can kind of worry that that's what a whole of our life is going to be like,
Mm.
right? But clearly, there are beautiful moments in there, and life is made up of both happy things and sad things. So, um, uh, so many threads in there in terms of what you shared. That uh, let's see, which one do I think we should go to? Mm. I want to go to this thread where you said that he felt like he couldn't really be himself or grieve for these things because he felt like life would fall apart. So, yeah, I think it's worth diving deeper into that. Uh, the other thing that you mentioned was the sense of control that we want to have over what will happen in life.
Mhm.
Uh, what that's trying to protect us from. Uh, and how do we come to terms with the fact that we might not have control? So, yeah, if you could speak to both of those a little bit.
Go ahead. Yeah. Well, I think, again, for me, in studying death and dying, I was given ample opportunity to acknowledge that I will die. And I think, like many of us, initially, when I sat with that earnestly, sincerely, especially after having watched my dad die, um, there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of anxiety that came up in me at the thought of losing my life. Um, but as I continued to sit with it and, again, like, reckon with the fact that, yeah, to be alive means that we will die, and just invite the thought that maybe this could become normal, even though it feels so not normal in this society. And we don't talk about death as like, oh, yeah, 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 we're going to die soon, but, and feel totally at peace with it. What if I could regard it in that way, that to lose anything, including my life, doesn't have to be a staggering failure? In fact, it's the essence of being human.
Mm.
We're going to receive things, we're going to lose things. But there's always an emphasis on celebrating what we get. And there's always a negativity around what we lose. Like, there's this sense that we have to really hold on to anything that we have, and we have to have more. And so we don't have, as at least I, growing up, didn't have as many practices around getting good at losing. And to some extent, it was when I practiced martial arts for a short time, And I started to realize that the way these people train is to get hit, is to experience pain, is to experience impact. They're not trying to avoid that. In getting hit, in having the impact, you generate the strength to not get knocked off by it, to not lose your center. You just, get hit, you know what it feels like, and then you keep going. And I think that practice for me totally shifted my perspective of like, oh, what if loss was normal? What if loss was something I didn't have to interpret as me doing something wrong, even though every person I've ever seen around me has regarded it in that way? What if that's just not true? And once I started asking that question and then doing my training and reading books from people who were writing about grief and death, they all had the same perspective. And I was like, oh, this is great. um, and again, the irony is that in embracing, oh, I'm going to lose things, including my life, even in this moment, like there's this exuberance, there's this energy, there's this enthusiasm, because then I get to, or at least I have come to a place of feeling so excited to live my life because I'm not thrown off by loss in the same way anymore, because I don't interpret it as a character flaw, or something I should have avoided. It's just like, okay, I lost this thing. And then I've talked to you so many times about the way I perceive grief is as a metabolization process. How do I draw the insight and wisdom from this loss that I've experienced and then release what's left that, I can carry with me, but then that would be a weight, and I want to be light as I move forward. So
You can see I'm grinning because I can feel that vitality radiating from you, and just had goosebumps when you're talking about training to get hit, and how that's allowed you to move through life lighter. Um, you know, there's this coach, Gibran, who I talk to from time to time, and he has this saying that uh, anxiety does not prevent death; it prevents life.
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
I'm seeing what what you're sharing have that same essence. Um, I, I do want to emphasize that bit that you mentioned, that the reason you're training to get hit is because getting hit is inevitable.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not that, it's not a sadomasochistic kind of affair over here.
Right.
As much as we want to have control and keep ourselves safe through life, it is an inevitability. All of us have known loss, and so meeting life more fully would mean accepting that fact, and only in accepting that can we meet it more fully and come more alive.
Yeah, and my partner Matt always speaks to the fact that like, once you get hit and you know what it feels like, you'll be more motivated to try to get good at blocking and stepping out of the way, and so there is these varying ways in which you develop skillfulness of how you experience hardship. And so, it's not just about not avoiding hardship and, so that you can, reap all the benefits from when things get hard. It's also about discerning how we learn from the experiences of what life brings into our world, and how we discern how we respond, how we protect ourselves, how we develop strength and wisdom to navigate life, so that the experiences we have, the losses we have, are the ones that are meant to be experienced and are meant to draw into our sense of self and develop even more strength and skill. Um, yeah, so, it is inevitable that we're going to get hit, that we're going to have a loss. And, you and I have talked about this also, that in these times where it feels like most days when you turn on your phone and look at the news, you get hit, you're impacted in some way by the things that are happening, in the sense of loss, in the sense of grief, in so many ways, that training your nervous system to understand what happens to your body when you feel those things so that you can be in relationship with yourself, know how you need to tend yourself as you navigate all of that, can keep you from getting taken out by it. You can get back up and keep going, or discern I need to take a nap, like knowing the right thing that you need in each moment, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, Again, lots to chew on there. Um, so one thing, like you rightly mentioned, this doesn't mean that we keep embracing trying to get more loss in our life. Like, oh, there's just so much nutrition here. That discernment is needed, and there are certain situations which we absolutely need to avoid and get away from. Um, but you also mentioned, getting nutrients from this process of grief. Um, I do want to go there, but before that, it seems to me that the prerequisite to that is having an awareness of what grief we might be carrying. And uh, you have this framework of the five gates of grief, which I found really helpful to figure out where we might be carrying grief that we are not aware of, because we have been talking about big and heavy things so far. You brought up one other way where we feel grief in terms of the news that we are seeing, but there are other areas of our life as well. So can you share that framework of the five gates of grief so we can develop that awareness?
Sure. So the five gates of grief were created by Francis Weller, and they're featured in his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which recently just came out with a reedition 10 years after the original edition in 2015. Um, it is literally a book that I keep near me at all times, so it is right here. And the five gates of grief offer a contemplation on varying ways in which we can experience and acknowledge the presence of grief. So I'll just go through them briefly, but the first gate is everything we love we will lose, which we kind of touched on. So just the acknowledgement that the things that we care about most we will lose. The places that have not known love, so grieving where and when there may be moments where we didn't receive care and support that we otherwise would have really appreciated, or as adults we look back to childhood and realize that we maybe didn't get what we could have really benefited from. The third is the sorrows of the world, so kind of like what we're talking about, what's happening in the world around us on a larger scale and in places that aren't in our immediate vicinity. Fourth is what we expected and did not receive, kind of similar to that second one, um, the grief of what we wish we had experienced or what we wish we had, because there's a sense that it might have changed the course of our life. With that one, I always think about if I had been raised in martial arts versus coming into martial arts in my
Mm.
30s. And then the fifth one is ancestral grief. There's the recognition that grief moves through generations, and some of us are carrying grief through long lines of ancestors that have felt that grief for a long time. Um, and I think, that's deeply embedded in so much of what we're experiencing in the world right now as well, deep ancestral grief. And those are the five gates of grief written by Francis Weller. But the sixth one that I add was added by my partner, and it feels really important, which is the gate on the other side of grief, which is just the acknowledgement that as we navigate grief, we then have to move forward with living. So it's not about just living in the grief and kind of having that process with you all the time. There's a point at which you've grieved the thing and you have to set it down, which can kind of be a challenging piece as well. So.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, I do want to touch on the other gates, but speak a bit more about that, right? Like this this hint of uh, being stuck in this process of grieving, and what does that final piece of letting go actually means?
Yeah, I mean, I've found it in my process to be so important, especially as a grief worker. It's kind of like eat, drink, and breathe grief some days. And I have to remind myself that life isn't a process of just constant grieving. It's a process of grieving and loving and living and learning and all these things, that all of these things are happening. And sometimes I'll move through a grief process with something, really come to terms with letting it go, why I need to let it go, what I'm leaving behind, what I've learned, all of that. But then I kind of fold it up and slip it into my pocket and move forward. And so it's still there. I haven't fully integrated it. I haven't fully metabolized it, like I like to say. I'm holding on to it. I'm lingering with it. I don't fully want to let go of it. And so the gate on the other side of grief is the kind of threshold where we let vitality back in. And you have to re-enter, without feeling as though you're betraying that loss. That to let go of it isn't to betray it, it's to integrate it. It's to fully have metabolized it and recognize it'll always in some way be a part of you, but to kind of stay attached to it, to hold on to it as if you actually maybe just tricked yourself into thinking you've grieved it, but actually you're still really not wanting to let it go, doesn't grant you access to, the vitality of life that comes once you've really moved through that process and release it.
And tell me more about that sense of betraying that loss. Uh, what's the trick to actually integrating and metabolizing, as you're saying? Like, what does that process really look like?
So, with all the folks that I've worked with, it can look so many ways. But I guess the way I would characterize it, or the curiosity that I tend to hold when I feel as though that's part of what's happening, is to understand what's in the sense of betrayal. Like, if you leave this behind, what does that feel like? What does that mean?
Mm.
And how is that informing your sense of yourself? Like, where is the sticking point? Like, where is it getting stuck?
Mm.
And so for each person, it can be a little different. Trying to think of a specific moment. I guess, you know, something that I have grieved is that I've personally decided to not have children. And so that was a difficult thing for me to choose, but for so many reasons and in so many ways, I sat with it for a long time and it was the right thing for me. But occasionally I'll get kind of stuck in how much I really wanted to choose that and how I want the circumstances or the course of my life to have navigated itself in a way that all those pieces would come together with me wholeheartedly choosing to have a child. But that's not the truth of the scenario I find myself in. And so it's almost like I could betray the loss, by, not acknowledging how much I really wanted that for so much of my life. And so the gate on the other side of grief that I'm passing through with that is just recognizing that occasionally it'll come up like, oh, I wish that, the trajectory of my life led to making that choice. I wish that the circumstances were different, but they're not. And so then I kind of ground into the truth of what is. I check myself to make sure maybe that decision is changing.
Mm.
And then often, for my process at least, I come back to, nope, it feels right. It feels true for me. And so being able to step away, recognizing that just having made that choice doesn't mean my heart doesn't still feel the way that it feels, doesn't mean that I don't kind of dream into another timeline where that happens, and I can still feel all of that, but also not hold myself back from living other aspects of my life or coming into a fullness in my sense of myself because I'm really like caught up, like, oh, I wanted that to be different, I have worked to like let it go so that I can fully inhabit Anara person that doesn't have, any physical children, but made that choice for deep, and important reasons. And so then that helps me kind of move past the sadness and the grief of it.
Hmm. That is a big one.
Hmm.
And, and what you're really pointing out to is that this is not a one-time process, right? Like I'm done with that one. Like, yeah, I'm all cried out about this bad thing that happened, or this thing that I really wanted and didn't happen, or this person that I lost.
Yeah.
It is an ongoing process of engaging with it and dealing with it.
Yeah, and that's a really important point for us to make, is that grief is nonlinear and doesn't necessarily have a start and an end. That's it. Those waves of grief, I think, it's pretty commonly known that people talk about grief like waves, and I think it's very fitting in the way that, you know, waves continue to kind of come. And if we have a practice of grief where we get to know how we experience grief and what happens in our body, we can detect when grief is coming in to our awareness. And that's like the beginning of the swell of the wave, because if not, we might not notice it until it's a full blown wave here. And so, yeah, I think grief is a continual process wherein, like we said, there's continuous opportunities for ends and changes and shifts and
Yeah,
loss.
yeah. The other thing this is bringing up for me is that, when you said about dreaming into other timelines, um, so much of my growing up in the last few years has been coming to this realization that no decision is perfect. There's always a trade-off. Just this decision of me living in Toronto right now versus being in India. There are benefits to this in terms of the culture that we have here, yeah, just the infrastructure, how welcoming the country is, uh, and on the other hand, all my family and friends are back home, but there are other issues over there,
Hmm.
and so there is that oscillation, and trying to come to peace with the paths that I've taken. But it doesn't mean that I yeah I don't dream into that other future. So, and which again, I think there's this, I don't know whether it's a pressure in our culture or why this norm is that, when we meet, like, or even on social media, just like to pretend that everything is perfect. And somehow if we accept that, no, here's this thing that I'm sad about. Yeah, it's somehow not welcome except for very close relationships.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I really appreciate that in terms of, yeah, like grieving the concept of perfection. I think that's a really powerful approach to our own work, is just recognizing the pursuit of perfection will often guide us away from ourselves in some way,
Yeah,
because the truth is that we're messy humans, and we tend to learn so much from challenge and loss. And so when we avoid it, or when we, perceive those moments in life as negative, or that we've done something wrong, it keeps us from wanting to dive into it and draw out everything that we can learn about ourselves or discern from the experience, that then helps us have insight into how do we want to live moving forward. And that's, part of what we're talking about here, is like utilizing the grief process for a more expansive and true experience of life. But it starts with, recognizing, maybe we're aiming towards perfection. Maybe we're judging ourselves really intensely. And those are kind of the stuck points that I was talking about earlier. There's so many little traps we can get caught in that lead us away from what's most real. And I find that grief is one of those pathways that always will lead us to what's most real. It just might not feel great.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I do want to move into the metabolization of it. But before that, this on the concept of perfection. Um, I had this very powerful moment just last Sunday. There's somebody who I'm just becoming friends with who's developing a process for helping human beings come into deeper connection with each other. And as part of that exercise, he made us meditate on a few things. He first asked us to dream about a future where we are completely free, and bring that scene into deep awareness. And for some reason, the scene that came into my mind was just I'm dancing freely and just full of joy. And the second thing then he asked us to do was feel into our bodies in the moment and see, like, what emotions were present and how how did life today look like. And I was feeling some anxiety and some sadness. Uh, and then as a third exercise, he asked us to see if we can merge the two scenes together, merge what we wanted with what was present. And for the first time, the thought came in my head was that what would it mean to dance freely while also being sad and anxious? And uh, that was a very powerful moment for me because it broke that illusion for a little bit. Like, oh, dancing freely does not mean that there will necessarily be nothing imperfect in life. There might be some stuff going on, but I might still be free. Uh,
Mm. Well, and for me, that example reframes perfection. Like the thought of you dancing as a way of moving with your anxiety and, even maybe, feeling some sadness and, crying and dancing and moving the energy is its own exuberance. And so is that not perfect? Like it really kind of breaks the illusion of, perfect doesn't mean without emotion. Perfect is real and true. Like that would be a perfect moment. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Whew, I feel like we've already covered a lot of ground here. And uh, uh, if we weren't doing a live, like I would just be probably taking time to like sit down for 15 minutes and just, you know, uh, take in all that we have talked about. Hmm.
Maybe we even can take just a minute to breathe, and everybody that's watching with us can take a moment to breathe. I think that's something else that socially we're not given a lot of permission to do. We're doing a live, we have to keep talking. You can just stop and take a breath.
Hey, why don't we do that? I'm going to have a sip of water as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna take a moment to check in with my body and my heart. Yeah, feeling the energy of where this conversation has led us to. And mostly feeling a lot of gratitude for the opportunity to talk about this topic. So, thank you, Akil.
Right back at you. Um, okay, so I think one thing we can go deeper into, you mentioned in terms of your dad, he was not able to lead a life true to himself because of the cultural norms and not uh, not being able to care for what was real and true for him. And like I want to talk about how the collective grief we carry on these fronts, which we don't metabolize, and the ways in which we block these things, how do they ripple out into the world and lead to the problems that we see today? And like, so how does this lie at the core of the many crises that we have?
Yeah. Um, I mean, again, like we were saying earlier, my sense is that when we don't give ourselves permission to grieve, we hold on to everything. We kind of can become like a dragon with its hoard, we just like accumulate. um, and that can generate a weight that can, have an impact on us. It's heavy to just hold on to and accumulate experiences, particularly painful ones that we maybe, continue to perceive or because we're doing something wrong, like again, the grief process gives that opportunity to clarify what's real and what's really happening. And so when we're not engaging with that, we might be accumulating things that aren't true and just kind of calcifying in that sense of what our experience is because we never pause to question it. And so I imagine it might be the case that, certain individuals and it's funny as I'm talking, there is a young person who is yelling outside and I'm feeling it kind of in the discordant, energy that we're talking about. But yeah, it's possible that can really alter how we show up in time and space and in our relationship. If we're holding on to things that we're not processing and letting go of, it can flavor the energy we bring into our relationships and into our work. And it may not be our intention, but those parts of us that go neglected will continue to make themselves known in varying ways. And so, yeah, I think some of what we're seeing happening in the world, some of the ways that certain individuals and groups are making choices, in my mind, in my observation, is because there's a lack of willingness to really see what's real and recognize that there might need to be change, there might need to be loss in order to allow ourselves to prioritize the well-being of people. And my sense is that for some of those individuals, they're just not interested in that, or, um, they would lose money if they did that, or whatever the case may be. Um, but usually it's connected to just not wanting to lose. And so
Mm.
again, if we come into relationship with grief in a way that allows us to become really masterful at allowing for loss to happen without perceiving that we are less than, we can be more free and we can engage in relationships in ways that don't have to extract, that don't have to harm, that don't have to demean or diminish anyone. And so it's my belief that grief is one of several processes that can invite us into right relationship with ourselves and each other in the natural world.
Hmm. So this, you mentioned this, that people become equivalent to this dragon trying to hoard their treasure. So basically, does it come down to then a sense of still having control or safety? Like, it's because they have not come to terms with the imperfection of life, and that loss is inevitable. They're trying to use that as a shield. And
That might be the case. Again, it depends on, the specifics of the situation and the person, but I do think that's something that can occur. I know it's happened for me in moments when I don't want something to change, although it is changing.
Hmm.
And so I can try to grasp to it. I can try to rend it into the position I want it to be in, but the reality that I've come to terms with is that's unnatural. That's
mm,
out of the character of what it means to be alive and be aging and, be of the nature to change, be of
mm,
the nature to lose things, and so when we're trying to work against our nature,
mm,
it makes me become something that is not necessarily who I wanna be, because if I'm trying to force things into the way I want them to be, I'm likely gonna behave in ways that are going to cause harm, are gonna be destructive, rather than acknowledging, "Okay, I don't want this to change, and yet it's changing."
mm,
There might have to be some part of me that changes with it so that I can flow with it, so that I don't have to fight it from happening, but I can move with it. And that is also not to say that in certain instances where something's changing that we want to, you know, impact the change that's occurring, that we want to, speak out. We can speak out, but it's the balance of recognizing there's some things within our control and some things that aren't within our control. And so I'm just speaking to the recognition that there's going to be things that aren't in our control. And so when we try to change some of those things in us,
mm,
um, yeah, it can just generate that unnatural energy that can in different ways also generate varying undesired outcomes. And so it's difficult to talk in the specificity of it because it kind of depends on each person and the
mm,
specifics of their circumstance. Um, but you can really just, like I said, get curious about what is happening. What am I feeling resistant to? What am I feeling anxious about or fearful? And why? So that
mm,
you get a clear sense of the landscape rather than perceiving that maybe this one little part that you're focused on because it doesn't look the way you want it to look. That's what you get hyper fixated on versus like broadening the lens and recognizing this one small piece might be moving. How can I see that in the larger landscape?
mm. Yeah. Mm. I Since you mentioned that it's difficult to talk to the specifics without there being like an individual case to examine. Uh, you know, I want to take my own example. Um, I had this climate tech startup back in India. Ran it from 2017 till it came to an end in the middle of COVID. And when I started it, uh, this clear sense of purpose and also the unending optimism of an entrepreneur that it's going to be a massive success
Mm,
eventually. And you know, uh, I went to the top schools back in India. I'd been very successful academically and in my career until then. So I expected that trajectory to continue. Uh, and when the startup ended in the middle of COVID, uh, you know, uh, it was really crushing. It was a very valuable experience. Very humbling. Made me a better person in many ways. But as it was ending, like bef- before failure became like an imminent possibility, I
mm,
didn't care about the fact that I was earning significantly lesser than what I used to be earlier, or my friends were racing ahead in their career, whereas I was struggling to make things work. Um, but as soon as it ended, like my mind was, what was all this for?
mm,
I could have been earning so much more. I could have been the vice president here or anything of those sorts here. And that led to a sense of resentment, entitlement. Uh, you know, when I started looking for a job, and like, oh, you need to compensate for these 3 years that I have put into this startup somehow. Like,
right.
because I would have been here this way. And you need to give me respect that is due to me because I know what I'm talking about. So I brought a very entitled energy. to those conversations and situations, uh, because I was angry that things did not work out the way that I wanted them to. Uh, and and it took me a while to realize that how this had perverted my attitude. Uh, while I was working on the problem, living the life that I wanted to, none of that mattered, right? But as soon as uh, things didn't work out the way I wanted to, and I was forced to lead this other script, I had a very angry and destructive energy.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. I can only like, it's not possible for me to go into the psyche of the some of the really powerful people who might be informed by trauma,
Mhm.
and wanting this sense of control, and are lashing out in various ways. But for me, if just that dealing with that if I could not come to terms with that failure and I was lashing out in these ways, some of these folks have had really terrible childhoods, and
Mhm.
like just like you're mentioning with your dad, there's a lot of trauma there. And if you marry that with a fierce intellect and the agency to go out and do things in the world, it can greatly amplify the damage that you end up doing.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing that is coming to mind is especially when I'm working with clients who are working around, climate grief or, you know, um, societal change grief, there's always a moment where I feel called to remind them of the larger context that they're experiencing. Like you said, you were feeling a lot of anger and a lot of resentment, which completely makes sense because something didn't work out. And because you had invested time and energy across a period of time, the loss wasn't just the loss of the company, it was the loss of time. And then, you exist within a structure and a system that I think many of us know that if there's a gap for any reason, and if the gap is because you invested time and energy in a thing that didn't work, there's that anxiety of like how I will be perceived. And so often I pause with people to grieve the recognition of what's real about this world. That like, if I think about my friend Akil trying something and it not working out, I'm like, cool, good for you for trying it. Like I'm not going to judge that you spent your time that way. I immediately am like, how else would you have known that it wouldn't work without trying it? Like it's not like that could have necessarily gone any other way than it did. So it's the circumstance that really puts the pressure on you to feel as though you did something wrong and maybe struggle with your process of grief and holding it as what's real, which includes the grief of you live in a world that was going to judge you for this thing versus celebrate that you tried something and then really support you as you pivot towards the next step. And so I just wanted to kind of mention that to me, there's these layers of grief as we contemplate our existence in the world. And one of those layers is grieving how we regard one another and how we feel about ourselves because we've been taught that that's, what's real and how we need to be navigating our path.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, Thanks for sharing that. Uh, yeah, there's definitely a challenge with that script of what does it mean to be successful, pursuit of that status, and that comparison with how others are doing versus following out our own path. Um, we are coming towards the end of our time here in a bit. So I want to ask, like, when we have this culture which is very productivity and status driven, and we have these notions of what success means, uh, how do you, what advice would you, give to somebody listening in about how can they bring in this uh, practice of grief, and start breaking away from some of these scripts and living a life that is more true to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think first it's starts with getting to know where you're really at and having the courage to let yourself be with maybe the fact that we're not all exactly where we'd like to be, experiencing exactly what we'd like to experience. And in a larger context, maybe existing in a world where things are happening that we wish weren't happening, but giving ourselves first the permission to recognize where we're at physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, so that you start with bedrock. You start with your sense of where you are in this moment, and then respond to that recognition of yourself with a lot of care, with a lot of um, compassion and understanding, even if and especially if you haven't received that care and compassion from other people. And then to that vein, finding people who can support and having those conversations, whether it be building up the courage to ask your friends or family, like, you know, what do you guys think about grief? Or even if grief is not something that was talked about in your family, is there someone that you feel like you could bring it up with to inquire their thoughts around it? Um, but then extending yourself also to people who have a level of skill, who are either a grief worker or a counselor or coach, who or spaces for grief, because there are many group grief spaces out there as well, where you can start just by listening. Even the people who have joined us and have listened into this conversation, I'm grateful at the thought of them taking a moment, as they continue on with their day, just to contemplate where they're at and how they're feeling, and if there might be grief present that wishes to be held, and seeking out resources and individuals that might be able to create a space to hold that with them. And then as you navigate grief in whatever form you do that, really remembering that the pace that we're used to in this world, I don't believe is the natural pace of things. If you go out into the forest or out, onto a top of a mountain, I think anybody who has that experience recognizes that like everything slows down. There's like a really different energetic experience when we're in nature. And so just honoring your pace and recognizing that grief is not something to get done as fast as possible, like we've already kind of touched on. It's something that'll be present throughout our whole lives, that we'll be contemplating and rolling over and looking at from all sides. And so finding the pace that feels good for you. And if you're holding space for someone with grief, using that as an opportunity to check in with yourself, how you feel, and trying to just be present with them, be present with yourself, and where and when you can take the space and time to drop in without that urgency, without that need to go fast, is just going to ensure that you're really listening to what you need as you navigate that process where any number of things can arise.
Yeah, yeah. Slowing down and taking time, yeah, so important. It's Yeah, you really can't have any awareness uh, without that. And um, I've been feeling overwhelmed by the pace of modern life of late. Like just, like go back 30 years, I think we've had too much progress.
Mm.
Uh,
It's difficult in so many ways to slow down. I guess I do want to kind of acknowledge, it's built into us to feel compelled to go that fast, and so it's difficult in that way. And also some of us, are not so fortunate as to have expanses of time. Some of us have to work 2, 3 jobs to keep up with what we need to provide for our families. But um, for those individuals, and even in moments when we're really busy, I like to remind folks that, a moment in your car, or walking to your house can be done with intention and just an opportunity to drop into yourself. And so you don't even necessarily need a lot of time, but time can kind of expand in a moment when you're giving yourself permission to practice being present.
Yeah, that, uh, yeah, even 5 minutes, the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. And my wife loves to sit with her tea, 15, 20 minutes in the morning. And yeah, her day goes significantly worse if she doesn't get that time. So yeah, even something like that. Hmm. Of course, we'll be talking more about these practices next week as well. So, you know, as we're coming towards the end of our time, I do want to share with folks that you know, you'll be leading a workshop for folks who are interested in learning more about these practices. Kind of give a high level overview of what people could do, but we'll go into specifics of these practices in that workshop, and also getting more into specifics of how grief might be present in our body in form of, let's say, numbness or anger, emotions that we don't typically associate with
Mhm.
grief or sadness being present. So, yeah, you know, if you're listening in, please do join in next week. Uh, the time is 9 December. That's a Tuesday, 6:30 p.m. EST. And thank you so much for listening in. And thank you so much for Inara for joining in. Where can people learn more about your work if anybody wants to get in touch with you? What should they do?
Yeah, so I have a Substack called Embodying Collapse. I talk quite a bit about grief in that context. So there's my Substack, and then also just launched a website which is embodied living and dying dot card CARRD .co. I'm assuming that we'll put links to all these things somewhere. Um, but embodied living and dying is a place where a lot of things are in motion for myself and my partner, Matt. But grief work is a big part of what we feel is really central to um, any process of coming into an awareness of ourselves and each other and the natural world. And so lots of different opportunities for learning about grief, gathering in space with people to just share about grief, and then nature-based opportunities. Because I think in nature, it's very helpful to drop into these contemplations and remember that we are of that world and we have built this world that we know, in the midst of the natural world, but kind of coming home to our animal self can remind us of some of the energy and skillfulness that we have access to. So yeah, that's where you can find me.
Love that. Love that. Uh, before we um, sign off, uh, I I do want you to reflect on a couple more things. And
Mhm.
of course, I should have asked you to reflect on those before I shared all of those things. But that is the nature of life conversations, I guess. Um, but uh, given uh, the title of your Substack, "Embodying Collapse," right? Uh, you know, what? How might grief practice help us deal with things like that are continuing to go wrong, and why might it be important to cultivate uh, that, like, you know, for a future which is uncertain? But also, how does how can that lead to renewal and a brighter future, right? Like, so I do want to ensure that we focus on the life giving and renewal aspects of grief as we sign off.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I started embodying collapse out of a deep sense that part of what I see that we aren't encouraged to have access to is the fullness of our bodies and beings, and how when we fully inhabit our bodies, it helps us to fully inhabit our lives, um, and connect to what matters to us. And so, if we're ever to access energy to make change or to lean into uncomfortable situations, to speak out, to protect ourselves and each other, we must be embodied. And in the process of embodiment, we also learn the sensations and how our body responds to challenge, to hardship, illness, collapse, to the things that can happen inside of our body and around us. And getting to know what we experience in those times also helps us to understand how we might shore ourselves up so that in the face of any of those things that can happen, are happening, we don't just shut down. And that's my deepest fear. I said this, the beginning of 2020 was just the psychological impact of what was beginning to unfold at that time. I could really feel, even in that moment, was going to have catastrophic effects. And I think across space and time, it's really not being encouraged to feel into our capacity to have strength and vitality, even in the face of hardship, is the lie we're kind of told, and we
Mm.
believe it. And so pushing ourselves to understand where those challenges arise in us, how we experience them, and then accessing resources and relationships that support us in our growth and in our development. Not that we have to have all the skills, because it's through community and through relationship that we skill share and resource share together, but so that especially the parts of us, that feel the most resistance, that have the likelihood of shutting down, are given the opportunity to feel into capacity, feel into strength, so that we, yeah, can continue to access joy, which is really important in these times, can continue to make and create with each other. And again, above all else, be deeply committed to right relationship, recognizing that if we're building anything from relationships that aren't healthy, aren't really, nourishing, kind of like soil. If you plant seeds in toxic soil, it's not going to work well. So being really committed to the invitation to live in ways that, even if they don't feel possible, aren't going to be possible if we don't believe it, and if we don't, commit and devote ourselves to the way that we want to see people living in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think this is one of those things where people have to take our word for it. Like, these are practices, when you once you try them out, you realize their power, and automatically lean into them more. Um, and I I do believe that uh, times of crises are times of great renewal and transformation as well. So if we can learn to uh, truly embrace these practices, and, live with the imperfection of our lives and still come into right relation with each other, then whatever we build on the other side will be far more healthy and wholesome. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, and it does feel like a process of remembering, because it's not like these things were just invented recently. The kind of core central elements of these practices and these ways of being, I believe, have been here for a long, long time, and certain cultures and certain lineages have been upholding right relationship, in so many different ways. And so, like you said, 30 years ago, when all the technology and everything kind of came to be, and it feels like we maybe took some turns we didn't mean to take, or maybe weren't as intentional as we could have been around, what the impact of those moments was going to be, there is like a kind of turning back and remembering, yeah, the truth of who we are and how we can be in relationship with ourselves and each other. And that's the renewal for me that is so exciting, is it's not like we have to invent something. It's all right here. Like this, planet, this earth is remarkable. And so it's worthy of our care, and we are worthy of each other's care. And that reminder in and of itself is, for me, a renewal and a remembering that that's what matters most.
I love that. I love that. Uh, yeah, we just need to remember who we are and that we are of this planet, and that what gives life meaning is having that healthy relationship with uh, the environment, with each other. Uh, yeah. So I think I think that is a good note to end on, Inara. Thank you so much again for taking the time to have this conversation. Uh,
Yeah. Thank you, Gil.
okay, and thank you everyone for joining in.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate you all showing up.
Uh, Take care.